Hey everyone, Nigel here. Just wanted to give you a heads up that today's video is technically a re-release. As we mentioned earlier in the week, our video editor is on vacation right now, so we decided it was a perfect time to put an updated version of this story back out, which was taken down due to a copyright issue. Don't worry, the problem was nowhere near as bad as the situation last time, but if you're interested, we'll tell you a little more at the very end of the video. Alright, let's get into it. At around 12 p.m. on January 7th, 1969, a 27-year-old Harvard PhD student named James Humphreys stepped out of an exam room at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He had just finished writing his general exams, the culmination of several years of work for he and his fellow archaeology classmates, and the last of the in-class portion of their degrees before they transitioned to working full-time on their dissertations. While this was a huge moment for James, the end of his exam was not merely accompanied by the usual feelings of relief and accomplishment that normally come with finally finishing a large or stressful task. Instead, his mind was becoming more and more preoccupied with concerns about his 23-year-old girlfriend, Jane Britton. Like James, Jane was an archaeological PhD student at Harvard, and she was also supposed to be at the Peabody Museum taking her general exams that morning. However, much to the surprise of James and the rest of her classmates, Jane had failed to show up. As soon as James got out of the exam that afternoon, he began to make the roughly 15-minute walk from the museum to his girlfriend's apartment building on University Road. Not only had Jane now missed her general exams, but James had tried to call her twice that morning, and neither call had been answered. On his way to the apartment building, he tried to reassure himself that there was some reasonable explanation for Jane's absence. Perhaps she was sick, or had simply slept in. However, neither of these seemed like Jane, who was normally an excellent student who was extremely dedicated to the work she was doing at school. It also didn't seem possible that Jane had simply gone somewhere else or forgotten about the important exams that morning. After all, it was only their second day of classes back from the winter break, and when James had been with her the previous night, she had discussed being nervous about the following day, indicating that she had no intention of being absent. When James arrived at Jane's building at 6 University Road, he quickly made his way up to her 4th-floor apartment, where he had last been just a few hours before. He and Jane had gone out to dinner with some friends from their program the previous night, before heading over to Cambridge Common to do some ice skating. They had returned to Jane's apartment around 10:30 p.m., and James had left about an hour later. Almost 13 hours to the minute after he had left Jane's apartment, James once again knocked at her door. He received no answer from inside, but the sound was enough to attract the attention of Jane's friends and next-door neighbors, Dawn and Jill Mitchell. Thinking that he had heard Jane, Dawn Mitchell walked out into the hallway, only to find James there instead. After a brief exchange, James informed him that he was there because Jane had missed her exam that morning. Having also seen Jane just a few hours earlier, Dawn was similarly concerned by this information and encouraged James to go into the apartment to check on her. After all, the door was always unlocked. After knocking again and receiving no answer for a second time, James did just that, trying the door handle and discovering that Jane's apartment was indeed unlocked. Upon taking his first tentative steps inside, James was hit with a gust of cold air and noticed that one of the kitchen windows in the apartment was open. He was sure that it had been closed when he left, though everything else appeared just as it had when he had last been there. It wasn't until James looked into his girlfriend's bedroom that he noticed something strange. Though Jane indeed appeared to be inside, it looked as though she was lying face down on her bed, and that her nightgown had been pulled up above her waist. Rather than trying to shake Jane awake, James immediately exited the apartment and asked Dawn Mitchell to grab his wife Jill. If Jane was only partially dressed, he figured that maybe she should go into the room and try to talk to her first. Jill agreed and went to see what was going on, but no sooner had she left than she came hurrying back. She was feeling sick by what she had just seen. Now in a state of panic, it was Dawn's turn to walk into the room. When he did, he noticed that Jane wasn't simply lying face down in her bed. A pile consisting of a sheepskin rug and a fur coat appeared to be covering her head. When Dawn pulled back the coat, he was horrified by what he saw. it was immediately obvious that Jane was dead. This is the story of the murder of Jane Britton and the nearly 50-year hunt to identify her killer. Before we get to the main part of today's story, we'd like to ask that if you enjoy our videos, to please remember to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this. It really helps us to build the channel, and if you've watched a few of our videos already, you might not even realize that you're not subscribed. While you're there, don't forget to hit the notification bell as well, in order to stay up to date with our latest releases. Okay, with that out of the way, back to the video. When police arrived at the crime scene a short time later, they began to perform a thorough search of Jane's apartment. They were immediately struck by the fact that very little in the residence seemed to be out of place. None of Jane's jewelry, money, or valuables had been stolen. Her pet turtle and cat were still inside the apartment unharmed, and according to her friends, boyfriend, and parents, her room was in its usual state of lived-in messiness. The obvious exception, of course, were the rug and fur coat that had been thrown on top of Jane, obscuring her head. This is where she had sustained the brutal injuries that had led to her death. An autopsy would soon reveal that Jane had been bludgeoned, likely with some sort of sharp-edged or pointed weapon. She had died from contusions and lacerations to the head, and at least one of the blows had been forceful enough to crack her skull. No murder weapon was found at the scene, but the initial thoughts of investigators were that they might be looking for a hatchet or some kind of small pick hammer. Though there was blood found in various places in Jane's room, most of it was confined to the bed itself. This, along with the fact that there didn't appear to be any signs of a struggle, and no one reported hearing any unusual noises coming from Jane's room the night before, seemed to suggest that she had been attacked in her sleep. She had also been sexually assaulted, though police would refuse to confirm this information for some time. To help narrow down the timeline surrounding the murder, investigators first turned to James Humphreys, as well as Dawn and Jill Mitchell. James explained that he had been out on a date with Jane the night before, that they had returned to her apartment at around 10:30 p.m., and that everything appeared to be fine when he left roughly an hour later. The Mitchells told police that a short time after James went home, Jane came to their apartment next door and the three of them drank a glass of sherry together. She had left at about 12:30 a.m., presumably to get a few hours of sleep before her exams later that morning. Based on these statements, detectives concluded that Jane had been killed roughly 10 to 12 hours before her body was found. When investigators expanded their questioning to other residents of the apartment building and the surrounding area, they spoke with at least two other witnesses who offered details that they thought could be of some help with the case. The first witness was the 7-year-old daughter of the building's superintendent, who claimed that she had heard unusual noises on the fire escape at around 9 p.m. the previous night. This fire escape originated in the building's courtyard and would have provided access to Jane's apartment through her kitchen window, the same window that James had found open at the time that he and the Mitchells discovered her body. The second witness was a man who was either described as a local transit worker or another resident of the apartment building, depending on which newspaper account you read from the time. This witness claimed that he had seen a man who he described as about 6 feet tall and weighing roughly 170 pounds, running from the apartment building at around 1:30 a.m. on the morning of Jane's murder. While some members of the investigative team speculated that these two witnesses may have heard and seen the perpetrator, they were unable to come to an agreement on the significance of either statement. In the case of the first witness, this was because the noises she had heard had been at 9 p.m., well before both the murder and the time when Jane and James had returned to the apartment. If the culprit had broken in at that time, why had James and Jane not noticed anything strange when they arrived back together? Likewise, Don Mitchell said that he had also been in the apartment during this time frame while Jane and James had still been out. Because Jane had a bigger fridge in her apartment, the Mitchells sometimes kept stuff in there, meaning that they occasionally went inside to grab things that they needed while she was out. Don said that when he entered the apartment that night, nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. As for the matter of the open kitchen window, police weren't certain whether this was significant either. Jane's bedroom window had also been found open, and according to residents of the building, it was common for many people to leave their windows open even in the middle of winter, as the building got swelteringly hot due to poor heating control. Though the second witness statement more closely matched the time frame in which the murder would have taken place, there was also nothing about it that could definitively link it to the case. After all, it was raining that night, and it seemed plausible that the person seen by the witness could have simply been running to a nearby car to avoid as much of the rain as possible. Within hours of the discovery of Jane's body, the outside of her apartment building was swarming with reporters eager to document the details of her chilling murder. By the following morning, news of the killing had spread across the country, even bumping coverage of Sirhan Sirhan's trial for the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy in many newspapers. Some of the early interest in the case was no doubt because of the family Jane belonged to. Her father, J. Boyd Britton, was the vice president of administration at Radcliffe College, a highly selective women's liberal arts college that, like Harvard, was also located in Cambridge. Radcliffe was one of the so-called Seven Sisters colleges that were initially created to function as a sort of female equivalent to the traditionally male Ivy League schools. Jane's mother, Ruth, was also involved in academia and was a visiting scholar in medieval history at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. However, it was the details about Jane herself, as well as the senseless way that her promising young life had so cruelly been snuffed out, that soon led the public to clamor for answers. Before her murder, it seemed that Jane had been destined for a promising career in her field. She was one of just a handful of people that had gone directly from graduating from Radcliffe College to her PhD program at Harvard. The summer before her death, she had been part of a group of students that had been chosen to participate in an archaeological expedition to Iran, where they had searched for Alexander the Great's lost citadel of Carmania. For many, it seemed unthinkable that such a talented young woman from a good family could end up the victim of such a brutal crime, especially since it had happened just a short walk away from one of the most prestigious schools in the country. Almost immediately, fingers started to be pointed at Harvard itself, when several reports came out detailing disturbing security flaws at the apartment building where Jane lived. Though the university had purchased the building just 2 years prior, it had been in a state of disrepair for some time, and residents alleged that their concerns about safety had been routinely ignored. According to reports from the time, locks were either broken or entirely missing at almost all of the building's 5 entrances, meaning that anyone could get in. Security allegedly wasn't any better once inside, as many of the tenants complained that what locks they did have on their doors could be temperamental, or were otherwise so broken or ineffective that they avoided using them altogether. It turned out that this had been exactly the case with Jane's apartment. Friends said that for the entire time she had lived at 6 University Road, she had never had a properly functioning lock on her door. The same was apparently true for many of the building's windows. In an article in the Boston Globe at the time, one tenant recalled how a neighbor had easily been able to force open her window while standing on the outside fire escape in order to release her pet cat. The criticisms about security at the apartment building were all the more alarming, considering Jane Britton was not the first young woman to be murdered there. In 1963, another graduate student named Beverly Sammons had been stabbed to death in an apartment just 2 floors below. Her murder had since been attributed to Albert DeSalvo, the so-called Boston Strangler. However, many had remained unconvinced of his involvement in the killing even after his confession. With Jane's murder now being the second to take place at the building in recent memory, some suggested that the 2 cases might be linked. In an attempt to quell public fears, police announced that they had found no reason to think that Jane's killing was related to Beverly Sammons. They were still confident that Beverly had been a victim of the Boston Strangler, and since DeSalvo was already in jail at the time of Jane Britton's murder, the 2 cases could not be linked. At the same time, detectives released what few details they had about their investigation into Jane's killing so far. The first of these details was that a sharp-edged stone belonging to Jane was believed to be missing from her apartment. While this stone was apparently later located, when police first reported its existence, they theorized that it could have been the murder weapon. The second detail was that 4 people had agreed to take lie detector tests in connection with the investigation. This was described more as a formality than anything, as 3 of the 4 people were James Humphreys and the 2 Mitchells, who police did not believe were involved in the crime. Lastly, and most intriguingly of all, investigators revealed that they had uncovered unknown fingerprints from the crime scene. Since everyone in Jane's circle of friends and family had been ruled out as a match to these prints, it was theorized that they might belong to the killer. Despite these revelations, police were left so far without any serious suspects, and as days began to pass, were beginning to feel leads drying up in the case. As a result, they were forced to chase down anything that might be significant, digging through Jane's personal telephone book to try and find anyone that they hadn't interviewed yet, and even setting up cameras at her funeral to see if they could capture photos or video of anyone acting suspiciously. Surprisingly, in the beginning, it appears that police were fairly forthcoming about the lack of progress in their investigation, admitting that they were frustrated by the lack of any apparent motivation behind the crime. One detective even told the papers, quote, "If we only had some kind of a handle to this case, we might make some progress." However, this transparency would not last. Things took an abrupt turn when the media began to report about a strange alleged clue that had been found at the scene of Jane's murder. This clue was red ochre, a naturally occurring reddish-brown powder that has been used by humans for thousands of years, usually as a pigment for painting or decorating. The substance had been found in multiple areas of Jane's room, and at least some had been discovered with her body. While the presence of the red ochre could easily have been attributed to the fact that Jane was an avid painter and would have used the pigment in her artwork, news reports began to speculate wildly when one professor pointed out that the powder also had another use. Many ancient societies sprinkled red ochre on their dead in order to purify them for the afterlife. The notion that Jane's killer might have sprinkled the powder on her body as some sort of ancient ritual was not only sensational, it also seemed to suggest that whoever was responsible for her murder might have known her. After all, the information about red ochre would have been common knowledge to any of Jane's anthropology and archaeology classmates. Angered by the rumors that were now swirling around the case, Cambridge Police Chief James Reagan ordered a news blackout in the Jane Britton investigation. From then on, no statements would be made to the press without the express permission of his office. For the next few weeks, the media continued to speculate about the case. However, they were mostly limited to recycling details from old stories, or relying on the few additional facts provided to them by police. It turned out that not many came, as police still struggled to uncover any new evidence. However, things wouldn't stay quiet for long. In early February, things took another dark turn when a second brutal murder was reported in Cambridge, one that seemed to have eerily similar details to the Jane Britton case. The victim's name was Ada Bean, a 50-year-old widow who lived less than a mile away from where Jane had been killed. Like Jane, Ada lived alone in a multi-story apartment building, one that had similar, albeit not quite as severe, security issues. Though some of the building's entrances had locks, several others did not, meaning that just like at 6 University Road, anyone could have had access to the crime scene. The similarities didn't end there, though. Ada had also been bludgeoned in the head and had been found lying on her bed. Like Jane, it appeared that Ada had been attacked in her sleep. Her nightgown had also been pulled up past her waist, and a blanket was found covering her head. Once again, while members of the public and the news media were quick to connect the two cases, police weren't so sure. They acknowledged the similarities between the murders, but said that there wasn't enough evidence to suggest a definitive link. At the same time that much of the attention turned to this new murder, a grand jury was convened to hear evidence in the Jane Britton case. Authorities hoped that the proceedings would help to distill the findings that they had made up until that point, and that in the process of getting witness statements on the record, they might somehow uncover helpful new information. This turned out to be wishful thinking, and several months in, the proceedings fizzled without ever coming to a vote about a potential suspect. After that, the murder of Jane Britton, which had so captivated the public's attention for months, slowly began to fade into obscurity. Ada Bean's case would soon follow. Though the investigation into Jane's murder remained officially open, decades would soon pass with no significant progress made in the case. Eventually, Cambridge police were ordered to hand over all of the files they had related to Jane's murder to the Massachusetts State Police. Occasionally, the case would catch the attention of a couple of new investigators, who hoped that a fresh set of eyes or advancements in technology might shed some light on the case. In the 1990s, two such detectives discovered that there was reason to be optimistic about solving Jane's murder. Despite the initial investigation taking place well before the use of DNA in forensics, it turned out that semen believed to belong to the perpetrator had been collected, and against the odds, the DNA had been preserved. However, this is where the investigation once again hit a dead end. The sample was fairly small, and testing against the federal CODIS database failed to produce a match to a suspect. After a retest in 2006 also failed to produce results, many investigators seemed to come to the conclusion that the case was destined to remain unsolved. In actuality, investigators were closer than they had ever been to an answer, but it would take pressure from the outside to finally get them to solve the case. Beginning in the mid-2010s, several people began to submit requests to the Middlesex District Attorney's Office, which was in charge of the Jane Britton investigation, asking for the records in the case to be made available to the public. Though these people weren't working together, and in most cases didn't even know about each other, they were all united by a common thread. They had become personally invested in Jane's case and believed that it had a good chance of being solved. Among this group of people were a former staff writer for The New Yorker named Becky Cooper, as well as a former journalist named Michael Widmer, both of whom felt a deep connection to the case. Cooper was drawn to Jane's story after first hearing about it while she was an undergraduate student at Harvard in 2009. By 2016, she had made it her personal mission to do what she could to help solve the case. Michael Widmer's connection to the case was arguably even more personal. Back in 1969, he had been a reporter for United Press International, and the Jane Britton murder was his first ever assignment for the agency. It was only his second day on the job when he wrote what would become one of the first ever news stories published about the case. Though the case had always stuck with Widmer, it wasn't until his retirement from the Massachusetts Taxpayers Association in 2015 that he finally had enough time to catch up with the investigation. Despite the beliefs of Cooper, Widmer, and others that Jane's murder could be solved if the records in her case were made public, the Middlesex DA's office apparently did not share their conviction. For the next several years, requests continued to come into the office, but each was denied on the grounds that the investigation was still open and that the release of any documents could jeopardize an eventual conviction. What little the office did release consisted of newspaper clippings and other things that had always been a matter of public record. This was particularly absurd when you consider that Widmer would have written some of these newspaper articles himself. According to him, even some of the information that had been provided to journalists back in 1969 was being withheld by that time. Left with no other option, he, Cooper, and others began to file lawsuits against the DA's office. The multi-year battle over the records was chronicled by Boston Globe writer Todd Wallach, who wrote several stories about the attempts of people to release the documents and the resistance they faced from Middlesex District Attorney Marion Ryan. Like Cooper and Widmer, Wallach pointed out that releasing records had produced significant new leads in other cold cases across the country, and seemed to be standard practice in many states outside of Massachusetts. He argued that the issues being faced in this case were part of a broader problem with government transparency in the state in general, and questioned whether the concerns expressed by police about a cold case being jeopardized were really valid after nearly 50 years. Though it appears that Cooper and Widmer never did win their legal battle against the Middlesex DA, their ultimate goal of Jane Britton's murder being solved did ultimately come to fruition, when in November of 2018, the DA's office announced that DNA evidence had finally yielded a match to a suspect. The suspect's name was Michael Sumter, a convicted serial rapist who had died in 2001 after being paroled into hospice care while suffering from terminal cancer. At the time the 2018 announcement was made, Sumter had already been linked by DNA to two other murders following his death: the 1972 murder of Ellen Rutchick and the 1973 murder of Mary Lee McLean. While both of these murders had taken place in Boston, Sumter was known to have ties to Cambridge as well. He had lived there as a child and had later worked less than a mile from Jane's apartment. At the time of Jane's murder, Sumter's girlfriend also lived in Cambridge. After identifying Sumter as the perpetrator in Jane's murder, DA Ryan laid out her office's theory of the case: that on the night of the murder, Sumter had stalked Jane and followed her home. He had then waited for James to leave before using the fire escape to enter Jane's apartment to assault and kill her. Ryan further stated that the man who had been seen running from the apartment building around 1:30 a.m. that morning probably had been Sumter, since his approximate height, weight, and description matched what the witness had seen at the time. Ironically, the red ochre powder that had driven much of the sensationalism around the case back in 1969 was declared to be a red herring. Ryan said that they now believed it was of no actual significance to the investigation. If you're like us, then you're probably wondering right about now why the DNA evidence in Jane's case came back as a match to Sumter in 2018, when no match could be found in 2006 or during previous tests. After all, surely Sumter's DNA would have been on file in the CODIS database by the time of his death in 2001. The best answer that we could find to this question is that it had to do with advancements in DNA technology, as well as the specific kinds of tests available at the time. Most people are probably aware that huge technological leaps have been made since the advent of DNA testing in the late 1980s. However, similar advances have also been made just within the last few years as well. It's worth pointing out that the test that linked Sumter to the other two murder cases by DNA happened well after the 2006 test in the Jane Britton case. The first happened in 2010, while the second happened in 2012. With this in mind, it seems possible that if the Middlesex DA's office had gone ahead and retested the DNA in Jane's case as soon as they received the first request for documents from people like Cooper and Widmer, then the case might have been solved years sooner. In fact, without people like them putting pressure on the DA's office to prove that they were still investigating the case, it's possible that it could have been many more years before anyone tried to retest the DNA. Regardless, at the time of this recording, Jane Britton's case remains the oldest one ever to be solved in Middlesex County. While Jane's friends and family members now have closure after 5 decades, sadly, some loose ends still remain in the case. Perhaps the most frustrating one of all is that despite the similarities between the two crimes, authorities say that they still do not believe Sumter was responsible for the murder of Ada Bean. At the present time, it seems that all we can do is hope that her case will one day be solved as well. Hey everyone, so as promised, we just wanted to give you a bit of information about the situation with today's video before we wrap up. As previously mentioned, today's story is actually an old one. However, a few months ago, we decided to take it down temporarily due to a copyright issue. We were actually contacted by Don Mitchell. Yes, as in Jane Britton's friend Don Mitchell, who pointed out that we failed to properly credit images that belonged to him. I want to be clear, Don was super nice about everything, and he reached out to us directly rather than copyright striking our channel. The reason it's taken us so long to put the video back up is, quite frankly, we've just been too busy. In addition to explaining everything, we also wanted to take a second to thank Don, who honestly seems like a great guy from our brief interactions. Also, we wanted to point you in the direction of a book that he actually wrote about the case. The book is called Shibai, Remembering Jane Britton's Murder, and is a memoir of Don's first-person account of the case, as well as how it affected him. It's a great read, and in case you're also interested in checking it out, we've left a link in the description below. Just to be clear, Don did not ask us to talk about his book. In fact, he doesn't even know that we've included this bit. We just thought it would be nice to show him a little love. Anyway, that's it for now. Thanks to each and every one of you who made it this far into the video. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, take care.